everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Taking on Tobacco Industry Pollution. I'm Carrie Cork, Senior Staff Attorney at the Public Health Law Center, and I'll be moderating the webinar today. Our speakers today are both attorneys at the Public Health Law Center. The center is a national network of legal centers and attorneys that support public health and commercial tobacco control policy at the local, state, and national levels. Founded in 2000, the Public Health Law Center is located at Mitchell-Hamlin School of Law, just over the river in the traditional homelands of the Dakota people. We offer free legal technical assistance to communities, public health advocates, and other partners around the U.S. in several ways through legal research, policy development, implementation, and defense, and a wealth of publications and resources which are all available on our website, publichealthlawcenter.org. We also do presentations, trainings, and webinars such as this one. We don't represent clients in court and we don't lobby. Throughout this webinar, we'll be referring to tobacco growing and manufacturing, but when we use that phrase, we're talking specifically about industrial scale commercial tobacco production. We're not talking about traditional tobacco as it is still used religiously, medicinally, and ceremoniously in many different cultures. This is a picture of one type of flowing tobacco leaf, which is indigenous to the Americas and dates back at least 8 millennia. Finally, the Public Health Law Center is committed to the principle that good health cannot be achieved without addressing health equity. Health equity means that everyone has access to the resources they need to improve their own health and maintain health outcomes. This means removing avoidable differences between groups of people, as well as overcoming and removing barriers that infringe on fairness, human rights, and environmental justice. Our webinar speakers today are Kira Hill and Hudson Kingston, staff attorneys at the Public Health Law Center. Both Kira and Hudson provide legal technical assistance to public health professionals and advocates working on tobacco control policies throughout the United States. Prior to joining the Public Health Law Center, both attorneys practiced environmental law. Kira worked as an environmental attorney in North Dakota and as an energy fellow and law clerk in California and DC. And Hudson's environmental and consumer rights work included stints at the White House Council on Environmental Quality, Center for Food Safety, Center for Digital Democracy, and Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn the podium over to our first speaker, Kira Hill. Kira?
Thanks so much, Carrie, and thanks to all of you for joining this webinar. So today I'll be talking about the upstream environmental impacts of tobacco production, specifically tobacco growing, curing, and manufacturing. My colleague Hudson will be discussing the environmental impacts that arise at the other end of the tobacco product life cycle, tobacco product waste, and he'll present a number of potential policy solutions to minimize or potentially eliminate that waste. And we'll end with a Q&A session. You may have noted that Carrie mentioned environmental justice in her earlier discussion of health equity. In the United States and internationally, health equity has been a focus of the environmental justice movement for almost 30 years. The environmental justice movement was born out of a need to address health inequities, and more specifically, the fact that low-income communities and communities of color bear a disproportionate burden of environmental pollution and its health effects. As my colleague Hudson will also delve into a little bit later, the environmental justice movement is founded upon 17 principles that articulate the importance of human rights, worker justice, multicultural expression and respect, meaningful participation, and freedom from environmental degradation. The image on this slide depicts the signing of President Clinton's 1994 executive order entitled Federal Actions to Address Environmental Justice in Minority Populations and Low-Income Populations. This executive order was the first major federal action on environmental justice in the United States. It requires that all federal agencies, such as FDA, make achieving environmental justice part of their missions. The memorandum that accompanied the executive order, excerpted here, clarifies the role that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 plays in also ensuring that those receiving federal funds do not use practices that discriminate on the basis of race, color, or national origin. Health equity and environmental justice are important to address because every step of the tobacco life cycle involves both health equity and environmental justice concerns. I'm going to be discussing the upstream aspects of this life cycle, so specifically the cultivation or growing stage, the curing stage, and what I'm referring to as manufacturing, which includes the primary processing and trading stages. This image comes from a 2018 paper analyzing the environmental impacts of each stage of the tobacco life cycle, which I'll reference a number of times throughout this presentation. And I'll provide a full list of my citations at the end of these slides, which will also be available later on our website. So let's talk about specific upstream environmental impacts. The impacts from the growing, curing, and manufacturing stages of tobacco production include deforestation, pesticide overuse and contamination, child labor, food and water insecurity, climate change, and mismanaged industrial waste. I'll be getting into all of this in a little bit more detail in a bit, but just to give you an idea of scale and seriousness of this problem, when we talk about deforestation, for example, we're talking about billions of trees being burned and razed every year. And when we talk about child labor, we're talking about children who are exposed to toxic levels of pesticides and nicotine poisoning from handling tobacco leaves. The demand for tobacco as we now know it could not have occurred without the mechanization of cigarette manufacturing in the 1880s. Now global production occurs at a gargantuan scale. 6 trillion cigarettes are manufactured every year, and nearly half of that production occurs in China. Industrial tobacco is grown either in a very narrow crop rotation or in no rotation at all, and in a monoculture, which means there's a field of nothing but one plant. The manufacture of all those cigarettes requires, as you can imagine, a lot of land and a lot of tobacco. In fact, today's demand for cigarettes requires 7.5 million metric tons of tobacco leaf and 4.3 million hectares of agricultural land, or an area roughly the size of Denmark. Making way for all that agricultural land requires a lot of forest clearing. The images on this slide are 2 Landsat images of a portion of Malawi in 1991 and 2017, respectively. The dark green areas are forest, and the light green areas are non-forested areas. A 2017 World Health Organization report that I'll reference a number of times throughout this presentation estimates that 70% of deforestation in Malawi is attributed to tobacco growing. In China, WHO estimates that 18% of deforestation occurs because of tobacco curing and growing alone. But the most damaging phase is actually the curing or drying process, which still involves wood fire curing in many countries. And in the countries that don't use wood fire curing, they're primarily using fossil fuels like coal or natural gas. To get a sense of how significant this is, consider that a 1978 investigative report into the tobacco curing process estimated that 1 tree's worth of wood is used to cure tobacco for about 300 cigarettes. After taking into account that over 6 trillion cigarettes are manufactured every year, and even making the conservative assumption that only half of those cigarettes are cured using a wood fire curing process, this amounts to an annual loss of more than 10 billion trees annually for curing alone. When considered together with the land clearing needed to grow tobacco, the 2018 study I mentioned earlier estimates emissions of CO2 equivalents to be in the range of 65 million tons. That's the 20.9 plus 45 tons indicated on the chart here. This is because forests are important carbon sinks, meaning they remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And they lose carbon reserves to the atmosphere when forest cover is destroyed. The burning of trees also releases CO2 back into the atmosphere. But remember the additional trees that are cut down to dry and burn tobacco? This estimate does not take into account the CO2 impact from that process. So taking into account that variable, one estimate of emissions resulting from all sources of tobacco production caused deforestation is as high as 5% of total global CO2 emissions. While we're still learning a lot about the value of forests to carbon sequestration, we know continued destruction of forest cover for tobacco production and curing is contributing to climate change. With annual demand for cigarettes projected to grow to 9 trillion cigarettes by 2025, the threat of continued deforestation, which is a significant driver of climate change, is alarming. While deforestation and desertification is, of course, not tied solely to tobacco production, climate change poses a public health threat in and of itself, as its impacts include, but are certainly not limited to, poor air and water quality related illness and death, extreme heat related illness and death, increased conflict, and threats to food sovereignty and food security. I've excerpted here a call to action signed by 70 public health focused groups that calls climate change the greatest public health challenge of the 21st century. Deforestation has other impacts as well, including loss of natural products and sources of medicine, and it can lead to the spread of human diseases like malaria and Ebola. Commercial tobacco growing also strains water resources and displaces food crops. Compared to many food crops, tobacco growing is a more water-intensive process, as the water used per metric ton of cultivated tobacco is twice that required for a ton of wheat, 5 times greater than the water required for tomatoes, and more than 8 times greater than what is necessary to grow potatoes. Sweet potatoes in particular may be a potentially useful substitute for tobacco growing in certain climates. The idea of growing food crops in lieu of tobacco is not unrealistic. In fact, many countries, due to economic realities, displace food in order to grow tobacco. The 2012 article in the journal Tobacco Control found that tobacco farming often occurs in the best and most fertile regions of countries such as Kenya and Bangladesh, displacing the production of other crops like vegetables and rice. And as I mentioned before, tobacco is primarily grown as a monocrop, which means the plants in the soil are vulnerable to diseases and pests that develop in the absence of agricultural diversity. In order to make crops grow year in and year out, they need to be treated with insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, and fumigants, and pests become resistant to these chemicals over time, becoming superbugs. For example, DDT, a damaging pesticide addressed in Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, which is often seen as having given birth to the modern day environmental movement, is still used in many developing countries. DDT was banned in the US and the EU after its use was linked to cancer in humans and the near extinction of the bald eagle and the peregrine falcon. Other pesticides commonly used are a group of insecticides called neonicotinoids, or neonics, because they're chemically related to nicotine. These have been linked to the decline of pollinators, where neonics have been used around the world and can accumulate in plants and groundwater. Pesticides are also damaging to soil microorganisms and aquatic resources. Finally, many of the chemical pesticides, as well as nitrogen fertilizer used to fertilize the increasingly damaged soil, are hydrocarbon-based, meaning they rely on petroleum inputs and are therefore energy intensive to produce themselves. The use of pesticides also exacts a significant toll on agricultural workers and their families who work in or live near the fields. Just as one small example of the toll pesticides can exact on children in particular, the drawing here is from a report by the organization Farm Worker Justice, pulling from a study done in 1998, comparing the cognitive abilities of children exposed to pesticides versus those who are not exposed to pesticides. Farm worker pesticide exposure occurs because workers apply chemical pesticides using handheld or backpack sprayers without any instruction, protective equipment, or training. These workers are also exposed to pesticides in quantities and mixtures that were never cleared for human exposure. In the 2012 tobacco control article I mentioned earlier, researchers found that between 26 and 33% of workers in Kenya and Malaysia displayed signs of pesticide poisoning, but many more tobacco workers exhibit signs of neurological and psychological conditions, dermal and respiratory issues. Pesticide exposure can also exacerbate other pre-existing health conditions. The impacts of pesticide exposure on workers is not just a problem in other countries. Due to weaknesses in the regulatory mechanisms governing pesticide use in the United States, language barriers, lack of training about symptoms of pesticide exposure, lack of enforcement and protective equipment, inadequate housing and sanitary conditions, and fear of retaliation, workers in the US and their families are also regularly exposed to toxic levels of pesticides from the tobacco industry. Perhaps most concerningly from a human rights standpoint, tobacco production in many areas relies on child labor. Child labor and human rights abuses enable the tobacco industry to evade $1.2 billion per year in labor costs. Human Rights Watch has published several investigative reports calling attention to this problem. Their findings call out tobacco giants like British American Tobacco and Imperial Brands for sourcing from Indonesia and Zimbabwe, where tobacco is a valuable export commodity and tobacco work is often done by children. And again, this is not limited to international tobacco production. Child labor is also prevalent in US tobacco growing as well as the broader agricultural industry due to lack of protections for minor agricultural workers under the Fair Labor Standards Act. In fact, one 2013 study conducted by Human Rights Watch showed that 75% of the 141 children interviewed ages 7 to 17, who all worked in tobacco fields, reported symptoms of acute nicotine poisoning, which I'll talk about in the next slide. Many of these children also reported symptoms of pesticide exposure. Almost all child tobacco workers reported that employers did not provide them with health education, safety training, or personal protective equipment. Many children reported having to wear plastic bags over their clothing. Children are particularly susceptible to pesticide toxicity, with both acute and chronic exposure capable of resulting in long-lasting health consequences such as cancer, reduced cognitive function, behavioral problems, and hormone disruption. The Atlantic and NPR have also done some excellent investigative reporting on this issue, and I have images from 2 of their reports on this slide. And as I just mentioned, the tobacco leaf itself, unlike most other agricultural products, is acutely poisonous due to the nicotine present in the leaf. An ailment known as green tobacco sickness, GTS, or the green monster, arises from absorption of nicotine through the skin, especially when the leaves are wet, or from clothing that has come in contact with wet tobacco plants. Children are especially susceptible to GTS. Some common symptoms of GTS are nausea, vomiting, headaches, weakness, and abdominal pain. While most production occurs internationally, farm workers in the US are vulnerable to GTS for the same reasons they are vulnerable to pesticide exposure, specifically the lack of protective equipment, training, language barriers, and access to healthcare. In fact, a 2001 study published in the Journal of Occupational and Environmental Medicine found that by the end of the summer working in tobacco, non-smoking farm workers had nicotine levels in the body equivalent to that of smokers. In short, the tobacco growing phase itself negatively impacts the lives and livelihoods of many people, and those impacts extend far beyond those we normally think of when we think about commercial tobacco. The next step in the tobacco life cycle is the manufacturing stage. The true environmental impacts from this stage are difficult to evaluate because the available data is limited. Analyzing this phase often requires relying on companies' own self-reported information. Also, China's national tobacco company does not release any publicly available environmental data, though it produces 44% of the world's cigarettes. That said, even the company's own data does provide some sense of the scale of resource use. According to its 2018 corporate responsibility report, the tobacco company Altria withdrew 790 million gallons of water from wetlands, rivers, lakes, and oceans, almost 1 billion gallons from groundwater, and almost another billion from municipal water supplies. But the greatest contributor to cigarette manufacturing's environmental impact is energy usage. China relies on coal for nearly 70% of its total energy consumption, meaning that much of the cigarette manufacturing is coal-fired. While some tobacco companies claim to have switched their facilities to natural gas as an energy source, this is problematic because there's no way to independently verify how many manufacturing facilities have actually been converted, and there's no guaranteed climate or air quality benefit by switching to natural gas. Tobacco manufacturing also produces industrial waste. This image was adapted from the 2018 supply chain analysis I've mentioned a couple of times, and it lists the estimated inputs and outputs in megatons of the manufacturing stage. These estimates are nonetheless somewhat conservative, as a 2015 World Health Organization bulletin estimated that in 1995 alone, tobacco manufacturing resulted in the production of more than 2 million metric tons of solid waste, 300,000 metric tons of nicotine-containing waste, and 200,000 metric tons of chemical waste, with toxic byproducts such as ammonia and hydrochloric acid. In addition to the CO2 emissions from tobacco growing and curing I discussed earlier, the yearly total for greenhouse gas emissions from the manufacturing process is close to 16 million metric tons, which makes manufacturing the second most impactful step for CO2 release after the curing stage. The environmental impacts of the tobacco life cycle do not end with manufacturing. They include additional greenhouse gas emissions and waste resulting from transportation, secondhand and thirdhand smoke resulting from the consumption of cigarettes, and finally, they include the many impacts of tobacco product waste. To touch briefly on waste, as you may know, cigarette butts are one of the greatest sources of ocean trash and have long been the single most collected item on the world's beaches. In fact, the most common form of microplastics found in the bodies of every Mediterranean sea turtle tested were not straws or water bottles, they were tires and cigarettes. Cigarette filters are made from cellulose acetate, which is a type of plastic. There is widespread awareness that cigarette butts damage the environment. These images were kindly provided to us by the California Tobacco Control Program and depict results from a 2018 online survey finding that 94% of California adults agreed with the statement, cigarette butts damage the environment. While more non-smokers agree that cigarette butts damage the environment than smokers, it's significant that even 85% of current cigarette smokers agree that cigarette butts damage the environment. While there's widespread awareness that cigarette butts damage the environment, there's a lot of work to be done to begin to spread the awareness of and ultimately address the environmental problems caused by the earlier phases in the commercial tobacco life cycle. Internationally, the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, Articles 17 and 18, acknowledge the importance of identifying economic opportunities outside of tobacco production, as well as the need to address the environmental impacts of tobacco cultivation and manufacturing. So I'll conclude by highlighting just a few key points. First, tobacco growing and manufacturing is contributing to climate change. It threatens water resources, worsens food insecurity, and causes losses to biodiversity. Second, the tobacco industry as we know it exists because of abusive labor practices that adversely impact the health of thousands. And finally, achieving health equity in the context of tobacco control means eliminating environmental harms of commercial tobacco production. This can only occur by internalization of currently externalized public health and environmental costs, and by potentially eliminating the industry entirely. As I mentioned before, I've listed some of the references I cited during my presentation here, and we'll be making these slides available on our website. And then finally, I would like to acknowledge our research assistant, Thomas Hexam, who did so much of the research and analysis I've referenced during this presentation, without whom the presentation would not have been possible. Both Thomas and Hudson recently published a paper describing all the issues I discussed in my presentation and more, which is now available on our website. And with that, Hudson, I will turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Kira. Well, welcome everyone. As you'll discover from the passionate webinar that this is an issue very close to my heart. I know it's close to all of ours. My name is Hudson Kingston. I'm a staff attorney here at the Public Health Law Center, and I'm going to be focusing right in on the tobacco waste issue that Kira so well set up. Tobacco waste as it relates to water pollution, hazardous waste, and then I'm also going to discuss policy solutions. These will be mostly at the state, local, and tribal level, but of course they are available policy solutions to all sorts of units of government and internationally quite possible as well. So this is a picture that came out in June of this year. It got a lot of news, and it was taken on a Florida beach by a woman who reminded us all that it's not cool to throw your butts on the beach, but we know from our research and from working in tobacco control that the butt that ended up in this little baby bird most likely wasn't littered on the beach. It floated down a river. It came into the marine environment through some other route, and it is, as Kira said, one of the most littered types of plastic pollution on the planet. I will be talking about policy solutions that address this sort of thing, the tobacco waste that is in our environment, but obviously there's the possibility for policy solutions for the bigger problems, up to and including eliminating the industry, as Kira said. As my colleague so beautifully set up, the Public Health Law Center works with health equity in mind in all the things we do, and that's especially true here in terms of tobacco product waste. Equity to us means that when you are working with policy solutions for communities, you work with the communities that have the biggest problems, and you work with the people in those communities to tailor solutions to them and share resources that are necessary. For tobacco product waste, it's just a fact that low income and communities of color have a lot more of this going on because of the density of retailers. Those things track perfectly. And addressing this problem and the stress and the extra environmental harm that comes from it requires partnering with these communities when coming up with solutions. So on that note, as Kira already said, health equity in this case comes very well coupled with environmental justice. And the nice thing, one very nice thing among many about the environmental justice movement is that we know it started on October 24th, through 27th in 1991 at this official conference that started the whole thing with the 17 principles of environmental justice. I don't have time to look to discuss all of them, but I wanted to pull out a few. Feel free to give them all a look later, they're great. Starting with number 6, environmental justice demands that hazardous wastes be accounted for, that people who produce them are strictly liable for their production and they cease producing them in order to stop the flow of toxic pollution into communities of color. Furthermore, number 14, environmental justice does not care about the bottom line of international corporations, including the tobacco industry. In fact, it is very concerned with the fact that the international corporations such as tobacco companies have gotten away with this sort of activity for so long. And then finally, we know that the choice to use tobacco products is highly problematic, presented that way because of the addictive quality of these products. So it's not really a matter of individual choice against regulation. But furthermore, environmental justice does say has identified individual choice as an important part of cleaning up these problems. My choice to do something should not be impacting someone else's right to live in a healthy environment. And these are just some of the policies that guide the discussion that we're doing today. Now, first of all, it might be helpful to know at smaller levels of government what's happened at bigger levels of government, because there are commitments at the highest levels to tackle these problems in terms of plastic waste getting into our world's oceans and our nation's waterways. I'm going to focus on 3 that are here in the US, but as you can see from these pictures, the EU and Canada have also come out with some policies of their own, which I'd be happy to talk about if there are any questions. First of all, there's California's trash amendments. This is something to deal with the very large problem that California has of marine litter and plastic pollution getting into the oceans, navigable waters, rivers, streams, and lakes in the state of California. As you can see, we have everything from product packaging to a jewel pod to cigarillo tips and cigarette butts. All of these things amount to a heck of a lot of pollution in the great state of California. So what did California do? Well, in 2015, they promulgated rules, which in 2016 became official when the EPA approved them. And they are now not only state, but also federally enforceable standards called colloquially the trash amendments. They are groundbreaking, first in the nation standards that will require local units of government to keep plastic pollution out of rivers and out of the ocean. And it's a policy that only California has done so far, but it is one that would be available in every state. This is what it looks like. If there is no other solution, local jurisdictions are going to have to install this type of capture technology to make sure that plastic is not getting into those rivers. Obviously, this is not a great outcome for public health. It's also really expensive. The better outcome for public health is to work further up the market to eliminate products in the first place so they're not being used, not being discarded, and don't need to be caught in these types of nets. But this is what local jurisdictions will have to do under the law if they don't come up with better solutions. This is just a look at what's in those nets. Obviously, it's not just tobacco waste, but you'll probably see some friends in there if you look closely. It is a large proportion by number of the waste that's found in the environment, and obviously it's going to have to be paired. Eliminating this type of waste is going to have to be paired with other effective policies if California is going to get where they're going. Similarly, here in Minnesota, there is a goal right now, not a law or a regulation, a goal to reduce water pollution by 25% by 2025 would be 500 years from now. That's no good. But 5 years from now, the state of Minnesota is endeavoring to reduce its pollution by a quarter. There isn't a clear definition of what this means, but the agencies at the state level have been working towards it and been coordinating their work. So it's possible that it will also come up with solutions such as eliminating tobacco product waste from lakes and rivers. Similar to that, the mayor's organization that covers the Mississippi River watershed have also committed to, by 2020, reducing their plastic pollution by 20%. That's right, 3 months from now, they intend to have accomplish the goal of removing 1/5 of plastic pollution going into the Mississippi River watershed. That's an aggressive goal. I'm not entirely sure how far they are along in getting there, but it is a commitment that has been made, and it's something that can drive work at the local policy level. Just to remind everybody, the Mississippi watershed is kind of big. It covers a large portion of North America, the majority of the lower 48 states. And while this commitment may be slightly shallow in that it's only 20%, it is quite broad in the geographic scope. So how many states is that? It's 32 states and the edge of 2 Canadian provinces. Overlaying those 3 commitments with the years that they're due, this is how much of the US is covered by just these 3 policy goals. Obviously, there could be goals all over the US in addition to these 3 that I'm outlining. But how are these states, and especially local or tribal or state government units, going to address this problem now that the commitments have been made? Well, there are 4 policies that we're going to be talking about today, and they're very much complementary. Well, I'd love to tell you that one of them is going to be a silver bullet that'll solve everything. Doing a combination of these 4 policies would be the strongest way to deal with the problem, and some of them really work well together when paired. First and foremost, sales restrictions. I think we are all pretty familiar with those in terms of e-cigarettes. In this last week, the state of Massachusetts has banned all vaping products, and other states have gone almost that far in prohibiting the sales of flavored e-cigarettes. But at the local level, sales restrictions have been proven to work, and they're very impactful for public health as well as protecting the environment. So to remind you of sort of the problem, cigarette butts are the most littered and most found kind of litter on the planet right now. It's trillions of units a year, and they're not really, they serve no purpose other than creating a huge amount of plastic pollution. It's not just a problem on our nation's beaches. It shows up in all sorts of marine environments. Fun fact, Minnesota has more shoreline than California, Florida, and Hawaii combined. So this is a big problem even here in the colder states that don't have nice beaches. I'm sure I'll get a comment. We have lovely beaches. They're not as nice. But as far as sales restrictions go, we have a resource that my colleague created that really delves into this deeply and comes to the conclusion that we know from federal court cases, from pioneering municipalities that have put sales prohibitions on menthol cigarettes, that it is possible to prohibit the sale of, for example, filtered cigarettes or particular types of tobacco products that have these characteristics that are known to cause harm. So I encourage you to look at this article if you're interested in the legal underpinnings. My colleague did a lot of work on this, and I find it very helpful myself. But just to touch on what he covers in that, in the Federal Tobacco Control Act, there is a preservation and a savings clause, and it's very clear in these. And the courts have confirmed that sales restrictions on certain types of tobacco products at the state and local level are in no way preempted by federal law. There is an error here. I did a ... over tribal authorities. I would like to say that tribal authorities are even more able to do these types of controls because they are not preempted the same way that state and locals are by the federal law. So tribal governments also can take advantage of this opportunity. So what would be considered in a sales restriction that was meant to protect the environment? Well, there are some obvious options. Cigarette butts have been talked about for a long time, and they're a huge problem. Cigarillo tips, product packaging, all of these things are not recyclable. They're not easily disposed of in responsible ways. And more often than not, they're getting littered. So those are the very obvious things that I would think most policy experts would be talking about already. But why stop there? There are products out there right now, such as this daily or disposable e-cigarette that are unrecyclable, unreusable, unrechargeable even, that are combinations of e-waste, nicotine waste, toxic kinds of metal, and potentially are liable to explode, as we'll talk about later. These products are used frequently, so just one of them may not be a big deal to a solid waste dump, but when there's hundreds being used by each individual user a year, that really adds up quickly. And prohibiting their sale would have an impact on overall hazardous waste loads in a community. Similarly, these pods are not made to be reused. They can be. You can go on YouTube right now and watch a teenager refill one. But generally speaking, they're discarded. They're thrown away, and they contain nicotine, e-liquid, metals, and other toxic substances. And they could be included in a sales prohibition at the local or state level and tribal level as well. Moving along, hazardous materials and waste laws are particularly apropos in a week when all of those states have announced actions against e-cigarettes based on their hazardous qualities, based on the fact that people are getting sick and dying. It might be interesting to know that back in the 70s and then confirmed in regulation in the 80s, liquid nicotine was and is announced to be acute hazardous waste subject to the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. So liquid nicotine, first regulated as a dangerous pesticide, is officially and without a doubt in every state of the union hazardous waste under the law. And in the long, thousands of page long document that discusses this, they talk about how it is an extremely hazardous waste. It is liable to kill you with a single dose or incapacitate you. EPA, in promulgating these regulations, found that these types of chemicals are dangerous to individuals. They are dangerous to aquatic, terrestrial, and atmospheric environments, and they're very dangerous to our society. They have a list of 300 incidents where humans or fish or large amounts of other plant and marine life were killed by spills of this type of toxic waste. So they backed it up with some pretty harrowing examples. And in their cost-benefit analysis, they said that their rules were supported because they would be eliminating the grief and suffering that happens because of these types of toxic spills. I haven't seen too many laws that are based on eliminating grief and suffering, but this one was a big win for the elimination of such things. And they did say also in this rulemaking that while the rules don't apply to all household hazardous waste, it was their hope that the people of America would find these rules so wonderful that they would implement them at their state and local levels where there's an opportunity to do so. So fast forward now from 1980 all the way to 2014, a lawyer in Michigan asked the EPA, hey, is nicotine still an acute hazardous waste? And the EPA said, heck yes. In 2015, before the FDA even asserted control over e-cigarettes, the agency concluded that e-liquids being used in e-cigarettes are a listed acute hazardous waste under our national hazardous waste laws. So in every state of the union, it's still the case that liquid nicotine must be disposed of correctly and pursuant to federal minimum standards. And then if you're wondering what happened after 2016 and FDA deeming, well, in a recent rulemaking this February, the current EPA administrators team determined that it was not appropriate to remove liquid nicotine from the list of acute hazardous wastes. They're still acutely toxic, there's no proof otherwise. And moreover, the EPA determined that since the FDA hasn't really actually regulated liquid nicotine, e-cigarettes, or even imposed any sort of limits on how concentrated the nicotine is, there's no reason at this point to do what the tobacco industry requested and remove liquid nicotine from the list of acute hazardous wastes. So just to summarize, in 1980, EPA determined that this stuff was hazardous waste. In 2015, the agency confirmed in a letter that this definitely applies to e-liquids. And in February of 2019, the current EPA, in a formal rulemaking, reconfirmed that e-liquids and e-cigarettes are acute hazardous waste under federal standards. So where does that put us? That's a lot of history. What's to be done about these little pods? Well, in that original rulemaking, they did quote the House committee that reported out this law. And one of the concerns that Congress had was the lack of information about the amounts and locations of hazardous waste. And one way that jurisdictions in the time since has worked on this is locally. They have worked on transparency and gathering that sort of data so that they know what's going on in their communities and they can address it. As an example, this is just a local ordinance in Anchorage, Alaska that applies to all hazardous materials. And if you see in the fine print there, it includes all hazardous wastes, which would include listed hazardous waste. This requires companies and businesses dealing in hazardous wastes to get licenses. It allows the city to fine them for violations. And one important element is that it requires placards, so warnings on the outside of buildings to show that a facility has this type of waste and that it's very dangerous. This is geared towards companies with large amounts of chemicals in a place, and there's an exception for some smaller amounts. But overall, this is a model that could be used in other places. This is an example of one of those placards. And just think about the truth in advertising that would come with having to put that up every time you were going to sell some e-cigarettes. But Alaska is Alaska, and it's hard to apply Alaska lessons to everywhere else. So just a quick digression, a trip to Garden Grove, California, and their hazardous materials disclosure ordinance. It's largely the same to the one in Anchorage. It's a little bit of a lighter touch, a little more protection for companies' trade secrets. But the problem that we find in a lot of these is that they weren't exactly designed to deal with consumer products. Specifically, this one, which is common among ones I've seen in California, has exceptions for tobacco products and for hazardous waste contained solely in consumer products. But under the authority that they had in passing this regulation, they could remove those exceptions. They could tweak them, and they could, as appropriately determined by their agencies and their city council, determined that it's time to apply existing transparency laws to products that have been shown to be quite dangerous. Quick digression or a quick turn from a highly technical environmental field to a common law jurisdiction thing, but public nuisance has been in the news as well lately. You might have heard about a little lawsuit between Oklahoma and the Johnson & Johnson Corporation over the opioid epidemic, and Oklahoma won that case on a public nuisance theory. The idea being that if you take a product, even if it's legal, and put it out in commerce and then push it and make sure that people have it and discount its addictive qualities and do things that cause huge amounts of human death and suffering, you should have to pay for causing public nuisance. This seems similar to me, and especially in the example of campuses and school facilities or public parks, where nobody wants to have tobacco products littered in their public park. Nobody asked for that. And in fact, it's illegal to provide these products to people who are underage, and yet they're finding them in middle schools and high schools all over the place. And under the hazardous waste laws I just told you about, these schools are responsible. They're on the hook for disposing of these things correctly as hazardous waste. It could add up to thousands of dollars and many hours of compliance costs at your local middle school every month. And it's really not fair to expect them to pay for that. So under public nuisance, it seems possible that state and local jurisdictions would have a method, an existing legal frame for finding a way to get that money, claw that money back. In a slightly similar example, for example, in the city of Los Angeles, a legal product is being sold illegally. In this case, it's marijuana. And at those illegal dispensaries, they are being sent $20,000 a day fines for having no license and no legal right to operate. Wow, how does the city do a $20,000 a day fine? Well, going again to an ordinance, they have declared such businesses to be a public nuisance. The maximum penalty per day is $20,000, and they're cumulative. So the state is actually also able to give a $30,000 a day fine. So these same businesses could be getting $50,000 for that. And then as you see in the middle, individuals can be fined $1,000 and face criminal charges. So this is just one way to use public nuisance. The public nuisance law will be different in different states, but it exists in all states, and it seems to be available to many units of government. Finally, fire safety might be familiar to people who are very familiar with the tobacco control regime, the world. It has been a big issue in terms of cigarettes over the years, and it seems equally applicable here new products. So this is a chart that's frequently updated by the FAA. It's every battery incident that happens on or around an airplane or in an airport. And as you'll see from my selection, they're not always lithium-ion batteries that are in e-cigarettes, but they often are. And you can go, and this is updated and the number always goes up, of examples of e-cigarettes that have blown up and lit on fire in our nation's airports. Another agency, FEMA, and their fire administration did a report that showed that as the sales of these products increased, the incidence of explosions that hurt people has gone up in lockstep. And then the FDA even has a webpage sort of focusing on the buyer beware element, but admitting that these products blow up, light on fire, and hurt people. Using data from another federal agency, researchers have shown that at least 2,000 people went to emergency rooms between 2015 and 2017 from these types of explosions. Obviously, that's an undercount of how many people were actually hurt because many people won't be going to the emergency room, but it's a significant and growing problem, much like poisoning through e-liquids in young kids has been. But that's not all. It's not just personal injury. There's been millions of dollars done in property damage. It's often tied to lithium-ion fires, but each one of those could be from an e-cigarette. A brush fire in Jefferson County, Colorado was caused by an employee's e-cigarette exploding in his pocket. And their lithium-ion batteries and e-cigarettes are a leading cause of garbage truck fires across the country, which is kind of funny, but it's also extremely expensive and a huge detriment to society. Also, the Association for Non-Smokers' Rights has chronicled just dozens of cases of houses and other buildings burning down because of e-cigarettes exploding and not being built safely. So just to go back to the federal preemption issue, very explicitly state, local, and obviously tribal governments are not preempted from setting fire safety standards. And there's the example, as I said, of cigarettes that exists in state and local law where there is a requirement in order to sell your product that you do certification and reporting using third-party standards that prove that your product is fire safe. If you can't provide that documentation, you can't sell your product. So it is a sales restriction at the base. And then there are fines for violations on sales, and there are steeper fines for lying. So fire safe e-cigarette laws could take this same tack as was done with cigarettes. And until an adequate third party, not created by the tobacco industry themselves, until an adequate third party standard exists, sales prohibitions would limit the sales of such products. Just want you guys to know we have publications out there already covering many of these policy options and more. As I already said, there's my colleague's aptly titled law review article and also a nice summary that we have on our website. We did, as Kira said, just put out a new publication covering the larger environmental impacts of the entire industry, both in the US and globally. And we do have a couple more publications coming out soon addressing policy options for tobacco product waste specifically and for the broader policy problems. That one's quite long. So I'm excited about that one coming out too. And obviously you found us because you're watching this webinar, but that's our contact information. Please reach out. And I believe that I can hand it over to Carrie now for any questions.
Great. Thank you very much for your presentation, Kira and Hudson. We have a few minutes for questions now. So please enter the questions, and I've got one that I can ask right now that we came in. What can a lithium battery do to an aquifer? Hudson?
Yeah, so that's actually been studied pretty well in a few studies. Researchers in Florida in 2015 took a bunch of e-cigarettes and using California standards for toxicity, they ground them up and figured out what sort of water pollution impacts you're looking at. And based just on the metal impacts alone, they found that a lot of e-cigarettes are toxic waste. It's based on how much lead is in the e-cigarettes, and I'm not sure if they also measured other toxic substances, but a lithium-ion battery contains a large amount of cobalt, which would also make it highly toxic and likely to have significant toxic water impacts over time. As I discussed, it also tends to explode and light on fire, which isn't good either.
Okay, thanks. Kira, are there alternatives to tobacco for those who rely on growing it for their livelihoods?
Sure. So yeah, as I mentioned, tobacco actually displaces food crops, and in an increasingly food insecure world, climate appropriate food crops are going to be a more important substitute for a pretty much useless product otherwise. But there are also potentially options for using tobacco in ways that do not harm people, but I think that's sort of a new area of research. So yeah, great question. There are definitely concerns about people who rely on tobacco growing for their livelihood and helping those people transition. So thanks.
Okay, thank you. All right, we have another question coming in. We would like to know if the deforestation can be connected to the vaping epidemic in addition to cigarettes. Even perhaps how much deforestation can be attributed to vaping versus smoking. I know that many people who vape believe they are making the environmentally friendly decision. And I'll just throw that open to either of you.
And I think we have a similar question about how the vaping industry acquires their tobacco. So I will try to answer those two right now to the best of my ability, which is that we don't know solid figures. So for example, Juul is very secretive about exactly where they source their tobacco from. We know that they source it mostly from the United States. I believe, at least that's the last I heard. And they chemically turn it into liquid nicotine before shipping it away to be put into Juul pods. So there is a large amount of nicotine being concentrated into a highly concentrated liquid and then sent around. But that's just one company, and I do believe that a large portion of these products are coming from China. And as Kira said, the biggest tobacco company in the world is in China, and a lot of tobacco agriculture happens in that part of the world as a result. So we don't have solid figures on that yet. If you'd like to send us an email, we'd be happy to dig into it more for you.
Thank you. Here's another question. Is there a possibility of a NAB of a ban on the sale of single-use plastic filters?
Absolutely. So I probably went over it a little bit too quickly, but the aptly written law review article by my colleague is called "Don't See More Butts," and it is on that exact issue. It is on the possibility of a prohibition on the sale of cigarettes with filters. This is something that has come up in the California legislature numerous times. It has been looked at by many people. It would not be preempted by federal law, and it does seem that it would be quite possible to do considering court precedents regarding menthol products. So yes, the option is available in U.S. jurisdictions to prohibit the sale of filtered cigarettes, and by doing that, get cigarette butts largely out of the market and out of your society.
Thank you. How much of the tobacco grown in the world is used to make nicotine used in e-cigarettes versus cigarettes?
So I think that's a little similar to the question that was asked earlier, but that is, as Hudson said, something that we're really interested in looking into because we don't have actual data on that yet, but definitely a really important question. And I think to the person's question before, e-cigarettes is not an environmentally friendly option. So that's just put that out there.
Are there environmental repercussions if a move is made to synthetic nicotine?
Absolutely. Do you have any thoughts?
You can go first.
Okay, so what we know about synthetic nicotine is that it's made in a lab. You have a big vat of chemicals, you're doing some stuff to it, you're creating this product that is for all intents and purposes the same as tobacco-derived nicotine, but you're doing it in a highly industrial lab setting. That is not without repercussions. You know, it might not have the same in-field effect, but they have to get their inputs from somewhere. A lot of people saying that they're making synthetic nicotine in the lab are just using different plants like tomatoes and eggplants. Also, synthetic nicotine is to date much more expensive and more difficult to make than tobacco-based nicotine. So for now, that's still an emerging product that might come out, but I don't think there's any reason to believe that synthetic nicotine would be better for the environment. It could be a lot worse.
And then you still have the waste issue.
Yeah, the industrial waste from the factory.
Okay, thank you. If we were to pursue a public nuisance strategy, would that mean that we would be suing the jurisdiction or advocating for a new ordinance?
So I think in states where there is the opportunity to do it as an ordinance, that is probably the best way to start. Having the jurisdiction define a public nuisance by ordinance makes it much easier for the jurisdiction to enforce against wrongdoers, and it makes it possible for members of the public to bring a private nuisance action based on their own damage. But I don't think in most cases you would be suing the jurisdiction. The lawsuit is against the people causing the nuisance. So often that's a property owner. In this case, it would be either a tobacco products manufacturer that's producing these products and making them available, or it would be the retailers that are providing them specifically to young people, knowing that they're going to be disposed of incorrectly. So I wouldn't think that in most cases it would be a lawsuit against the jurisdiction.
Okay. Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. And that is on rural communities purchasing more vape products than what were currently thought smokeless tobacco products.
We will get back to you on that one. Please send us an email. I'm sure that has been studied, but that was not part of our research for this project.
Okay. Well, thank you. We still have more questions coming in, but we are unfortunately out of time. So we'll do our best to address any of these questions we've received and weren't able to answer today. So thank you all for attending our webinar. Good afternoon.